Well, it is great to be back. We had a wonderful time at camp, and are excited to be back with our church family. Summers are funny; you kind of wind up all over the place, and suddenly you realize that we haven't actually been at Bethel for different reasons for 5 or 6 weeks in a row. So it's good to be back. Well, there's lots of things that we love to do in the summer. We've had a great time at camp. We've gone camping. We've done boating. We've done all kinds of different things. My personal favorite thing to do in the summer is actually to play volleyball. I'm not sure if my slide's coming up. We'll give it a minute. But I just absolutely love playing volleyball. And a couple of years ago, I started playing in these 2-on-2 beach volleyball leagues and learned a lot about the sport. But one of the things that I've learned to love about 2-on-2 beach volleyball is that there's not that many players. There's only 4 people on the field, on the court at a time, and you're only playing with one other person on your team. So you kind of know who's making the mistakes, okay? And the fun of beach volleyball is that even for someone like myself, I'm playing against people who are, let's just say, a little bit younger than me. I'm getting older, I'm slower, but there's this fascinating mental game that gets played when you're playing in a 2-on-2 sport, where you realize that it's not the stronger players that necessarily win, or the harder hitters, or the better defenders. It's the mentally resilient players sometimes who actually wind up winning the game. Because what tends to happen when you've got 2 players playing together on a team is that when things start to go wrong, there's a very human tendency to want to blame one another. And I've learned over the years in playing volleyball that the thing that can undo a team faster than anything else is when one of the players on the team starts to blame the other player and kind of point the finger at them for the problems that they're having. Even better, when they commit what psychologists call the fundamental attribution error. Now, the fundamental attribution error is this: it's our tendency to explain somebody else's behavior based on internal factors such as personality or disposition, and to underestimate the influence that external factors such as situational influences have on another person's behavior. To put it simply, it's what happens when somebody makes a mistake beside you and doesn't get to a ball in time. And instead of thinking, oh, it was a rough play, or maybe the wind caught it, you think to yourself, lazy. That was a lazy move. You didn't get that ball because you're lazy and you're not as committed as I am. And you begin to think through in your mind all the reasons why they didn't do that. And all the reasons why they didn't do it tend to be internal things. It's things related to their character. They're not as committed. They're lazy. They're just not a very hard worker. Instead of thinking, well, maybe the wind caught the ball, or maybe they misread the play as the ball was coming over the net. And you commit the fundamental attribution error. You begin to assume that the problems that they're having are due to something inside as opposed to outside. And then on top of that, you begin to assume to yourself, I'm not like that. I'm not the lazy one. All the points that we've lost this game, it must be this other person because I'm not a lazy person. And you begin to think better of yourself and worse of them. Well, this isn't just something that happens in sports. It's something that happens in life. I see it happen in my marriage quite often. There's a temptation in my heart to blame Lonnie for things that happen. And instead of thinking, this happened because Lonnie was busy or distracted or something else happened, think, oh no, this happened because Lonnie doesn't care. I do it with my kids, I do it with my coworkers. There's this temptation in my life to assume that when somebody does me wrong, it's because they have ill will towards me or a bad heart, as opposed to considering the situation. And then on top of that, to assume that I'm not like that. When I do things that offend Lonnie or hurt Lonnie, it's done out of a good heart, but just kind of a mistaken action. And I commit the fundamental attribution error. We tend to minimize our flaws while exaggerating those of others. We tend to minimize our sins while exaggerating those of others. And this can become true, especially true when it comes to people closest to us, to members of our family, our coworkers, our neighbors, and even brothers and sisters at church. And the story that we're going to look at today is Jesus dealing, I think, in many ways, with the fundamental attribution error. So the story we're going to look at is found in Matthew 18. And as we open to the Gospel of Matthew, I just want to throw out a quick reminder, a couple things that are useful for us to keep in mind as we open the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew's written to a Jewish audience. So Matthew's kind of got the expectation that his audience is going to catch on to all the little things that kind of are connected, that connect Jesus to the prophecies of the Old Testament. The particular section that we're looking at in Matthew can be divided up into 5 sections, and we're kind of in the middle section of Matthew, and a section where Matthew is intentionally telling stories that deal with different expectations of the Messiah. So he's pointing out ways that people expected Jesus to be one thing when he was in fact quite different from that. He deals with the fact, he deals with the upside down nature of the kingdom, where the first are last, where leaders serve, where true wealth is gained by giving it away. And significantly for us this morning, Jesus deals with the fact that in the kingdom of God, we don't get revenge on one another, but instead we seek forgiveness. As it often happens in the parables, a parable is a story that Jesus would tell to illustrate something and to kind of draw people in to think deeper about an idea. And in many cases, like this one, Jesus is dealing with kind of an explicit teaching that he's said. He's taught them something about the nature of forgiveness. He's taught them, in kind of direct statements. And then they come back to him with a question, and he tells a story to kind of drive the point home. And that's what happens in the story. Jesus has just told them about the ethic of forgiveness in Matthew 18:15 to 20. If your brother sins against you, go and show him his fault just between the two of you. If he listens to you, you've won your brother over. But if he will not listen, take 1 or 2 others along, that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. So Jesus gives them really clear teaching on kind of the how of forgiveness. How are we going to deal with forgiveness? What's the mechanism that we're going to put in place so that we would forgive one another? And then Jesus, through this question that Peter asked, tells a story to give us a picture of what that should actually look like. So our story begins with Peter asking this question in Matthew 18, verse 21. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times, or 70 times 7 times. Therefore the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will repay everything. The servant's master took pity on him and canceled the debt and let him go. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, be patient with me, and I will pay it back. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. You wicked servant, he said, I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant, just as I had on you? In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he could pay back all that he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. So our story begins with Peter asking a question to clarify what Jesus has been saying about forgiveness. How many times should I forgive my brother? Peter, thinking that he could impress Jesus, perhaps, said 7 times? Because 7 times actually surpassed what the rabbis taught at that time. The rabbis taught that it was reasonable to forgive somebody 3 times, but the 4th time, you shouldn't let them off the hook. You shouldn't forgive them. So Peter wants to impress Jesus, and he says, how many times should I forgive him? 7 times, Jesus? And Jesus responds and says, no, not 7 times, but 77 times. The translation is kind of unclear. 77 times or 70 times 7. And what Jesus is saying here, in kind of an ancient Near East parlance, it's kind of the same thing as saying 7 times? No, like 7,000 times, like 7 million times. It's intentional hyperbole meant to make the point that, listen, way, way more than you think. You think 7 times? 7 million, 7 bajillion times. This is how many times you actually need to forgive. And then he tells the story to try to make the point. So it's important to remember when we read a parable, it's not that everything is particularly symbolic in here, but it's a story that's meant to illustrate a point. Jesus also uses parables in a particular way. One of the things that Jesus uses parables to do is to actually make people stop and think deeper. It's actually a form of meditation, meditative teaching. He's actually trying to say something that on the one hand presses home what the answer is, but then on the other hand forces you to stop and think more deeply about what he's saying. He's actually trying to press you to think deeply about this, and this is what happens in this story. Sometimes the answer is, the immediate answer is clear, but there's something deeper that he's pressing in on. So Jesus introduces us to his first character, a man who's described as a servant. The guy's not just a servant, though, and it's worth kind of pointing out that when he says servant here, we're talking about a man who is likely a high-level governor. We know this based on the amount of money that he owes. This wasn't a home foreclosure. This wasn't a car loan gone wrong or some credit card debt. The amount of money that this guy owed was astronomical. The only way that you could actually potentially owe that much money would be if you were a governor who had been collecting taxes for a year, and then the king sends out the message, hey, it's time to clear the accounts, bring me all the taxes that you've been collecting in my name. And he says, I kind of lost it, it's gone. There is no money to give you. The NIV translate that this man owns 10,000 bags of gold, but the word there is talent. And a talent is not a coin or a denomination of currency. It's actually a way to describe a day of wages. So a talent was actually the equivalent of between 6,000 and 10,000 days' wages. So when you begin to do the math, we're talking about potentially easily $5 billion that this man owes. So when Jesus tells this story, and right away points out that a servant owes $5 billion, he's using an intentionally exaggerated number. He's trying to point out just how big this man's debt actually was. It's not just normal household debt, but the kind of money that could destabilize the kingdom, that could destabilize the throne of the king to whom he owes this. It's the kind of debt that's accrued through possibly some kind of corruption or incompetency. In Canada, we had a Senate expense scandal a couple of years ago where we had over $1 million in inappropriate expenses from 30 different senators, and we had a national outrage over this Senate expense inquiry, right? And here we have this man who comes before a king and he owes $5 billion. And what happens? The king responds to the man's inability to pay his debt by ordering that he would be sold into slavery to repay the debt. Now, when you're $5 billion in debt, you're not being sold into slavery because the king thinks that he's going to somehow get his money back, right? The king isn't selling him into slavery thinking, well, that'll take care of that bad debt issue that I've got. He's doing it in a punitive way. It's not about repayment. But the man begins to plead with the king, insisting that he could pay the king back, if only he was given sufficient time. I don't know how much time is sufficient to pay back $5 billion. It's a long time. So this was impossible. The king knew it, which left the king with a choice. He could punish the man by selling his family into slavery and still not get the money back, or he could choose to forgive the man's debt and still not get the money back. Either way, the king isn't getting the money back. So the king, in an absolutely unexpected fashion, forgives the debt and sets the man free from it. Now, if we pause here in our story and just think about what's happened here, I think there's something significant. The king had a choice to make, but regardless of how he would choose, he's not going to get justice. He's not going to get his money back. The choice he had to make was between punishing and forgiving, but it wasn't a choice of justice. And when we've been hurt by people, we have a choice to make. Will we punish them by hurting them back? Or will we forgive, taking their debt on ourselves? Regardless of how we choose, we can't undo the hurt that's been done to us. But we have a choice to make. Our story continues. There was this recently forgiven man, this governor. He tracks down a man who's owed him money. And in utter contrast to the treatment that he received from the king, he immediately begins to choke this man, saying, "Give me back my money," loan shark style. He chokes this man. The man insists that he can repay him. He uses almost the same words that he had used when he explained his debt to the king. Give me enough time and I can repay. But he throws him in prison until he can pay back the debt. How long does it take to pay back a debt while you're in prison? A whole lot longer. There's not a lot of hope to make money while you're in prison. He effectively ruins the chance of the man paying the debt down, despite the fact that this 100 denarii, these 100 silver coins, represented just a couple $1,000s. This man actually had the potential to pay back the debt, but the man didn't actually give him the chance. So how does this happen? How do we go from receiving an unbelievable gift of several $1 billion in debt forgiveness, despite the fact that he's likely accrued the debt through corruption and incompetence, to immediately crushing the man who owes him a fraction of what he owed? Well, the other servants pass the story on to the king, who calls the governor back to his palace, where he calls him a wicked servant and says, I canceled all of your debt because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant, just as I had on you? The king orders him to be turned over to the jailers to be tortured until he paid back all of what he owed. And Jesus finishes this story with a warning. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother from your heart. Well, let's observe a couple things about this story. I find it helpful the way that Jesus talks about forgiveness in terms of debt. There's something clear and tangible about money that sometimes isn't so clear when it comes to our hurt feelings and the ways that we're offended. It's also obvious from a debt. When somebody owes money that they can't repay, it's pretty clear that the money doesn't just kind of disappear, but somebody still has to pay the debt. When I was a kid, my parents hired somebody to build us a barn. They paid him a significant deposit to do the work, with the balance to be paid upon completion. Well, he came back a few months later. We couldn't find him for a while, and then he came back a few months later to let us know that he had declared bankruptcy, and that the money that we had given him to buy materials, he had not bought any materials. Instead, he drank it away, and he would not be able to build the barn. So my parents got in line behind the other creditors to try to recover some of the money that they had lost from this man. And I remember as a kid trying to understand what was happening, because after a while, it became pretty clear that my parents had maybe gotten a couple $100 back. They'd gotten a little bit back, but it became very clear that they weren't going to get any more money back. And they decided to simply walk away from the table. There wasn't anything, the man simply had nothing else to give. And it became really clear to me at that time that in the case of bad debt, somebody has to pay. And in this case, my parents paid. Right? The money didn't just disappear, but he'd spent the money, and therefore my parents took on that debt in a sense when they chose to walk away and forgive the debt. There was no more money to get, and they lost the money in this case. And I think that's a good picture, in many ways, of forgiveness. Forgiveness is us choosing to accept a loss rather than make somebody else pay. And this has been a really practical analogy for me to keep in my head as I deal with issues of forgiveness in my life. That when I choose to forgive someone, what I am choosing to do is not make them pay the debt that they seem to owe me. Because in my heart, I'm tempted to make them pay over and over and over again. For small things, I'm tempted to make them pay for what I think they owe me. When we hurt, we seek to hurt in return. And we do it as though unconsciously trying to make someone pay us back a debt that they owe us. Now, often we just do this really subtly, don't we? Rather than being outright aggressive, we take somebody who's hurt us and we become passive-aggressive with them. Death by 1,000 cuts. Someone who's been rude or hurt us, we respond by acting bitterly towards them. But not so much that they notice, just enough that perhaps they feel awkward around us. We respond maybe through sarcasm. I think sometimes in the church we respond through gossip and by talking about other people. And rather than dealing with the situation head on, rather than actually forgiving people, we can be tempted to actually just make them pay over and over and over again through small ways, by talking about them behind their back, or by maintaining bitterness in our heart that leads us to be sarcastic or cold with them. It's a danger in the way that we relate to one another. And one of the questions that I often ask myself when I'm dealing with interpersonal conflict, to test whether I'm actually walking in forgiveness with somebody, is whether I'm using my words to try to make them pay. I use it as a measuring stick and as a warning to myself that I need to be careful with my words and actions towards others, because my tendency is to want to continue to punish others rather than forgiving them. I had a significant work conflict this past spring with a coworker, and they acted in a way that was deeply hurtful to me. And even though we took the time to work through what had happened, and we were reconciled and kind of worked through all the hurt and talked about it, coming out of that process, there was still a temptation every time somebody would bring up their name to want to just kind of slide a comment in there, like, oh, he's not that great, or oh, no, she's not like that, or oh, yeah, I've worked with them before, they're okay, and just subtly belittle them. And I had to guard myself and to continue to practice forgiveness by choosing to not make them pay, by choosing not to punish them with my words or by slandering their reputation. And I bring this up because I don't think I'm alone in this. I think in a very polite Canadian culture, where we don't always deal with conflict head on, our temptation is to deal with it behind doors, to deal with it in hushed conversations rather than face to face. And that we fail to do what Jesus has warned us to do, to forgive your brother from your heart. So the question that I continue to ask myself as I deal with conflict and as I deal with people who have hurt me is, Andy, are you still trying to make them pay? As I look at my interactions with them, are you still trying to make them pay for something that they did that hurt you? Or have you actually forgiven them? Because forgiveness isn't something that happens in an instant. It's a choice that I continue to make in relationship with others. The second thing I want to point out from this story, Jesus uses exaggerated dollar figures to help us see how likely we are to fall into the trap of minimizing our own failings while exaggerating the failings of others. Right? He uses the difference between a couple $1,000s and $5 billion to make sure that you kind of get that point that we commit the fundamental attribution error. We tend to minimize our forgiveness, which he values at $5 billion, while at the same time looking at the wrongs that are done against us as being these incredibly significant debts that demand immediate justice. We view ourselves with great optimism, judging ourselves by our intentions rather than just by our actions. But when it comes to others, we judge by their actions and allow our imagination to fill in the details. I point this out because I think Jesus is driving towards a point that we need to understand in order to live out what he's saying. When we minimize our own sin, when we minimize our own failures, our own debt, we're unlikely to live with a recognition of just how much we've been forgiven. We become like the man who's been forgiven a massive debt and then condemns the man who owes him a little. And yet Jesus wants us to be people who live with a profound sense of our own culpabilities, that we be marked by a profound sense of gratitude and grace because of his forgiveness. It seems like we're designed so that the pathway to being able to forgive others begins with us having a transformative experience of forgiveness ourselves. Why? Because it's in experiencing forgiveness that we actually begin to come to terms with our own failures. And being in touch with our own brokenness actually begins to breed empathy and the ability to experience a compassionate understanding of another's perspective. We're designed so that the pathway to being able to forgive others begins with us having a transformative experience of forgiveness. So what do we actually do with all of this? How do we actually put this into practice? There's a temptation to want to just say, the answer is what Jesus said at the end of the story, right? You need to forgive your brother, you need to forgive your sisters from your heart. We just need to be people of forgiveness, and to kind of close the page on it. But what I want you to actually stop and think about is that Jesus tells this story for a reason. He's trying to drive down to a hard issue that he doesn't want them to miss. In telling the story of a king to whom is owed a great debt that can't be repaid, Jesus begins to point out the how of forgiveness. How do we actually forgive? The implication of the story is that our own experience of deep forgiveness is meant to somehow transform us from people who minimize our own sins to be people who understand our own sin and forgiveness and choose to offer forgiveness to others. This story is a great retelling of the gospel, isn't it? It's Jesus pointing to what the gospel, pointing it to a particular angle of what the message of the gospel actually is. That the message of the gospel is that you owe a great debt to a great king. And yet that king has chosen to take that debt on himself and to forgive you. But the story of the gospel is better than this parable, because not only has the king chosen to forgive your debt, he's actually brought you back into the family. Paul tells us that we have an inheritance, incorruptible, undefiled, being kept for us in heaven. Not only has your debt been forgiven, but you've been restored into the family fortune. You've been brought back in so that you would actually have a name, that you would actually have a position, that we're sons and daughters of the king, and that you would actually have an inheritance. And we need to get that peace and meditate on that peace in order that we would actually become people who forgive others. That's the how of the story. How do we become people who forgive from our hearts? Oh, it happens when we actually begin to treasure and meditate on the way that the king has gone all the way to bringing us back home. The king who not only forgives us, but who gives us a fortune, who gives us an inheritance, who brings us back in. Paul in Colossians 3, he's outlining for the church the kind of transformation that we should seek as we put on Christ, and he says this: "Put on then as God's holy, chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another, and if anyone has a complaint against another, forgiving each other, as the Lord has forgiven you, so you must also forgive." What Jesus makes implicit, Paul makes explicit when he talks about it. He points it out. He says, don't miss this. The way that you forgive is to experience forgiveness. As Christ has forgiven you, you need to become a forgiving people. What Jesus gives us in this parable isn't just an instruction on forgiveness, but a sense of how our experience of forgiveness ought to transform us into the kind of people who forgive deeply, freely, and from our hearts. So our story began with a question that Peter asks, right? How many times should I forgive? But to answer the question, Jesus asks a question in return through his story. How much have you been forgiven? If in our relationships with others, if in your relationships with others, you're asking the question of how many times, the answer is to go back and meditate again on how many times you've been forgiven. The answer is to go back again and look at the great debt that's been forgiven you and the great life and riches that's been promised to you. And when we struggle with unforgiveness, that's the place we need to go. Let's pray. Father, my words fail, and our words fail to express how great forgiveness you will purchase for us. That you, the one who's been wronged, has chosen to take on our debt. And that you've chosen to restore us, that you've loved us enough to call us sons and daughters. To hold on to an inheritance for us, sealed by your Spirit. Father, I pray that our community, our church, would be marked by an instinctive move towards forgiveness in our relationships with one another. Because we know what it is to be forgiven. Father, in our marriages, would you make us people who quickly see our own sin and who are slow to see the failings of others. In our parenting, Father, in all of our relationships, would you help us to be people who are quick to forgive because we know what it is to experience unmerited grace. pray again, would you transform us through your gospel? We pray this in Jesus' name.